everyone. I'm Kirsten Cullenberg, Programs Manager at the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Now, normally I am one of the members of our team behind the scenes producing these webinars, but today I have the pleasure of welcoming you all. Today we have with us one of the few people to have sat across from the Iranians and the North Koreans at the negotiating table, Ambassador Wendy Sherman. She is Professor of Public Leadership and Director of the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School and Senior Fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center. And her book, Not for the Faint of Heart, Lessons in Courage, Power, and Persistence, takes readers into the mind of one of our most effective negotiators to learn how to apply core skills of diplomacy to the challenges in our own lives. Moderating today's program is our good friend, Lee CullumA. I'd like to remind all of our viewers that you can purchase a copy of Not for the Faint of Heart at interabangbooks.com. Interabang is one of our good partners here in Dallas and a local bookstore, so go ahead and support them by purchasing your copy today. And a reminder, if you use the code dfwworld at their online checkout, you will receive 10% off your purchase, not just of Not for the Faint of Heart, but for any of the books that are in your cart. And additionally, today, if you enter in the code dfwworld, you will receive a signed book plate in her copy. So go ahead and purchase that today. I'd like to thank our promotional partners for today's program, the World Affairs Councils of America Network, as well as the Foreign Policy Association, and specifically the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire and the World Affairs Council of New Orleans. You can subscribe to our YouTube page, DFW World, to view not only this program, but all of our past programs and future programs. So I hope that you'll continue to engage with us in that way and subscribe today. Additionally, you can view a list of all of our upcoming programs at dfwworld.org/events. Now, moderating today's conversation is prominent television, radio, and print journalist Lee CullumA. She currently hosts CEO on KERA and regularly contributes columns to the Dallas Morning News. Lee is a senior fellow of the Tower Center at SMU and a fellow of the Dallas Institute for Humanities and Culture. On the board of the Council of Foreign Relations for 10 years, Lee is now involved in many other policy organizations and institutions. I know that she is going to lead a marvelous discussion, and I look forward to listening to it. Take it away, Lee.
Thank you, Kirsten, and it's really lovely to be here with Ambassador Wendy Sherman today. She has had an incredible career and continues to. She is director of the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard's Kennedy School. She is a senior fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, also at Harvard, and is on that board as well. She's a senior counselor with Albright Stonebridge, and she helped Madeleine Albright found that firm when the two of them left the State Department. Of course, Wendy returned to the State Department and became Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. She led the 18-member team that negotiated the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. It was passed and was negotiated and completed in 2015. The current administration withdrew from that agreement in May 2018. And Wendy, I'm wondering if this administration should change its mind or a new administration should want to find its way back to the JCPOA. Would that, in your view, be possible?
Well, first of all, it's terrific to be with you, Lee. I'm a great admirer of your career in journalism, and terrific to be with the World Affairs Council and with councils from all over the country in this terrific audience. I watched that little promo clip at the beginning, and you've got a fantastic lineup of speakers here in Dallas, Fort Worth. And of course, we all have our eyes on Texas these days. And I do want to encourage everybody, whatever your preference, to go out and vote. It's one of our strengths when we negotiate around the world that we are a democracy. And so we need to show the world that we remain a really engaged and invested and involved democracy. As for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, yes, I think it's possible to go back to it. It won't be easy. We've lost a lot of ground. It was sort of interestingly because it was negotiated with other partners, with France, Great Britain, Germany, the European Union, Russia, China. You can see on the stage, everybody you see there, Secretary John Kerry, Foreign Minister Zarif, the High Representative of the European Union, Federica Mogherini, who coordinated the talks, the other foreign ministers. Because it was multilateral, even when the United States pulled out, in 2018 under President Trump, the deal hung together for a very long time. It's now started to shred a little bit as Iran has taken some actions that are reversible, but still head in the wrong direction. So I think there will have to be quite a bit of work to get back to it. And because it's now several years old, we would hope there would be a follow-on agreement to make sure that it has the longevity it needs and that we can deal with some of the other issues of concern regarding Iran. But there's a lot to be done in the world, in a world that's pretty tough right now, with the entire world facing COVID, an economic crisis, and a lot of conflicts around the world.
That's certainly true. And of course, you've taken part in a lot of them, as you write in your book. And I do want to say how much I enjoyed reading, not for the faint of heart. It moves almost in a novelistic way from hotel room to hotel room, where you're negotiating all kinds of scientific and technological and military issues. But back to the agreement for a moment, the administration was what was critical because it didn't deal with the mischief making of Iran and Yemen and Syria and Iraq and in the Middle East. And you say in your book that it was impossible to reach an agreement that would encompass all those things. Is that still what you believe?
Yeah, so we were dealing with all those other issues, just not in this negotiation. We still had, and we still today have, sanctions that deal with the state sponsorship of terrorism. We have sanctions on the human rights abuses. We have sanctions on their missiles. We have sanctions on their arms trading. All of those elements stayed in place. All of our work with the Gulf and with Israel and with other countries around the world to stop their malign behavior in the region, stop them from putting Americans into prison in Tehran. All of those things remained in place. But what President Obama decided was that it was critical to ensure that Iran not obtain a nuclear weapon, because if they got a nuclear weapon, then they would be so powerful, they would deter all these other actions that we had underway. So we had to get the bomb off the table. And lastly, if we tried to do it all in one package, one, Iran wasn't ready to do that. But secondly, we would have been sort of compromising different elements. So Iran might have said, okay, we'll give less money to Hamas and Hezbollah, but we want more advanced centrifuges for uranium enrichment, which would have been a bad deal on all counts. So it was really impossible to do. It would have taken even more years than it took us to do this. But those issues are very, very important and need to be dealt with. And President Obama tried to deal with them even as we were negotiating the deal around their nuclear weapons ambitions.
Well, as you said, if you got that off the table, that's the leverage Iran had, and it would certainly help with these other negotiations. But even in the narrow realm, relatively narrow realm in which you were working, you achieved, you wrote, a great deal more than was expected. What bonuses were you able to wrest from the Iranians in Vienna?
Well, I think what was so important about this is that we got a verification and monitoring regime that is unlike any in the world. It is much more intrusive. You see me sitting there with Secretary Kerry at the negotiating table. Next to him is Secretary Ernie Moniz, Rob Malley from the White House, and closest next to me is John Feiner, Secretary Kerry's Chief of Staff. Across the table from the Secretary with the white beard and white balding head is Javad Zarif, the Foreign Minister of Iran. Next to him is Ali Salehi, across from Ernie Moniz, and Salehi was the head of the Atomic Energy Agency in Tehran and a vice president of Tehran. So we were able to ensure a long time frame for this agreement. We got to ensure that Iran made a commitment to never obtain a nuclear weapon. We got intrusion and inspection regimes that don't exist anywhere else in the world. And really, really important, we opened up a channel of communications with Iran. So after the deal, when American sailors were taken by the Iranians, Secretary Kerry could pick up the phone and talk to Javad Zarif and say, you know, let those sailors go. They didn't do anything wrong. Within 24 hours, they were home. He was able to, we had a separate negotiation going on to get Americans out of Evin prison. We were able to do that. So these things all began to chip away at the downsides of our non-existent relationship and open up a critical channel of communication.
Of course, that critical channel had its seeds right after George W. Bush, as president, gave his Axis of Evil speech, Iran and Iraq and North Korea. And you have written, and I didn't know this, it was intriguing, the ambassador of Iran to Washington reached out to the administration and tried to get something going. Tell us about that.
Yes, they tried to get something going with the George Bush administration, and they considered it and decided not to go there. Things were too complicated at the time. The Europeans actually tried to negotiate with Iran as early as 2003, didn't make lots of progress. They got closer in later years, but things fell apart. And things really began to click, not just in the multilateral channel, but in a secret channel that President Obama opened up first with Ahmadinejad, the president of Iran, who was what I call a hardliner.
You're not kidding. Hard-hearted hardliner.
A hardliner. And when President Rouhani, who was just a hardliner, not a hardliner, got elected president, it really opened up some space for some serious negotiations.
But the intriguing thing is that ambassador was Zarif. Javad Zarif.
Yes,
who turned out to be your principal negotiator. And you wrote that Secretary Kerry, then chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said he's a very far-sighted thinker. We need to look into this.
Yes,
well,
Zarif lived in the United States for 30 years. And he spoke perfect English. In fact, all of the members of the delegation spoke and wrote perfect English. And the funny part of that is before Zarif became foreign minister, when Ahmadinejad was president, and there was another negotiating team, they did all the negotiations in Farsi. Nobody spoke English. And then when Zarif created his team, one of the people who was on Jalili's team joined Zarif's team, and he spoke perfect English, and we had never known it.
Well, just as you were getting started, something very weird happened, and it involved a used car salesman from Texas. What in the world was going on?
Well, indeed, that used car salesman appeared to be moving from Mexico through Texas to New York, to Washington, D.C., to place a bomb at the Cafe Milano in Washington to blow up the ambassador from Saudi Arabia. I was brand new as the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, and all of a sudden it was my job not only to talk with the FBI and the intelligence community, but to talk with embassies all over the world, get our ambassadors to go in and say, Iran was trying to do something that was quite nefarious and quite damaging, and just imagine if he had done so. And it was really a DEA agent, a drug enforcement agent, who tipped us off and got us the intelligence and the understanding of what was going on to foil this plot. And so there were agents at New York's Kennedy Airport to pick him up and take him to jail.
Well, he was evidently Iranian born and had a cousin highly placed in the Quds force.
Very much so. Very much so.
Quite something. Well, you spent several weeks at the Palais Coburg Hotel in Vienna at Theodor Herzl Plaza, and you said actually it was the perfect place for these negotiations. Why was that?
It was the perfect place because it had immense security. It had buildings around it where you could put SWAT teams as necessary for security. And the Austrians provided tremendous security. We, of course, had security of our own as well. To get into the hotel, you had to get through security. To get to rooms, you had to get through security. And in all of the days that I spent there, nearly a full month, I ate exactly one meal outside of the hotel. People worked incredibly hard, and Secretary Kerry, who was there for the last 2.5 weeks, was there with a broken femur on crutches, on as little pain medication as he could take, so he would be very alert for these very difficult last days. It was quite an extraordinary situation. And outside, as you said, there was Theodor Herzl Platz. It was a plaza that was perfect for all of your colleagues, the journalists, to set up. And there were literally hundreds of them who watched every move, waiting every day to see if something was going to happen.
And you would go out and speak to the press, the thronging mob from the media, and you would explain to them that it was like a Rubik's Cube. Everything had to fit together. If one piece fell apart, there it is.
There it is. So this Rubik's Cube was made up by one of my colleagues on our negotiating team who was from the Department of Energy, and every block has a different thing on it: sanctions, enrichment, the UN Security Council resolutions, nuclear cooperation, plutonium. And what I would say to the press would say to me, well, are you 20% there? Are you 50% there? And I would say to them, it's binary. If that last piece doesn't click in place, there's no deal. So you can get all these other pieces, very much a three-dimensional game, in place. And if that last piece doesn't click in place, every other piece moves and there is no deal.
Well, of course, Vienna is full of spies, as you say in your book. That's why I enjoyed it so much. I love spy thrillers. And you knew that you were under surveillance, and you found a very clever way to communicate with your British counterpart. What was that?
Yes, so I had a little patio outside of my suite. There was a wall behind that patio between my room and the outside. And so we could sit there and write notes to each other about what we thought the bottom lines could and should be. It would be hard. No one could pick up a sound because we weren't talking. And it would be very hard for someone to put a camera, because they'd have to go way above the wall. And we were writing in tiny pencil, little pieces of paper, and covering them with our hands to show to each other. So we were able then to have a conversation that could stay pretty secure.
I was quite moved to read about what you call this army of people who were backing you up in Washington. They were at the State Department, the Treasury Department, the Pentagon, the CIA, the Energy Department, the labs in New Mexico and Illinois and Nashville. I was quite touched by that. And I wonder, is this fantastic infrastructure still there, do you think?
Well, you know, that's a very good question. One of the things that's been disheartening for me is that so many of our agencies and departments and institutions have been hollowed out. You know, a president of the United States makes whatever choices that president wants to make, and I don't want to be partisan today, but I will say that it is very disturbing that the State Department, even the Pentagon, and certainly the intelligence agencies have been diminished under the current administration. And the reason that is so unfortunate is because some of our greatest strength out in the world is that we have had the deepest and the widest bench of talent. We have been seen as having very strong and powerful institutions that speak for our country, not just for one political party, not for Democrats or Republicans or independents, but for the United States of America. And we have the Foreign Service and the Civil Service who serve our country. They are not political. They are about what is best in our national interests. And we have lost some of that. It can be rebuilt, but it will be very hard to do so. So it is of great concern. And we had an extraordinary team backed up, as you said, by hundreds of people in the US government, a very robust policy process every step of the way. President Obama understood every single element of the deal. Certainly Secretary Kerry did, and Secretary Moniz. And so we could get real-time decisions, and I would know what I could and could not do, what our team could and could not do. Secretary Kerry would know what the president was willing to do and not do, because he understood everything that we were doing.
Of course, you were involved in the government earlier than that in the Bill Clinton administration, and you worked on North Korea. You accompanied Secretary Albright to Pyongyang very late in the administration, the second administration. I think it was the year 2000. And you went to a stadium, as I recall. I mean, it was quite a deal. Tell us how that went.
Yeah, so the person in the purple back there with longer hair and not quite as white as it is today is me. And you see Secretary Albright there with Kim Jong-il, the father of Kim Jong-un, who is now the leader of North Korea. This was truly an extraordinary visit. It came about because about 2.5 weeks earlier, Cho Myung-ruk, who was from the National Defense Commission, the military, paid a visit to Washington, D.C. This was really a response to a visit that I made with former Secretary Bill Perry 10 months earlier to try to open up channels with North Korea. And so this was North Korea's response. It took that long for them to make that decision. So when Cho came to the United States, he said he brought a letter from Kim Jong-il inviting the President of the United States to come the following week. Well, that's sort of not how we do things. We don't have presidents show up a week later in North Korea, at least not President Clinton. And so we said, that's not going to happen. And then they said, well, maybe Secretary Albright could come. And we said, well, it'll take us a little while to organize ourselves. So we went about 2 weeks later, which is incredibly fast. We had no embassy, no people in North Korea. We brought in all of our equipment, all of our communications, all of our supplies. We even brought in Marine Guards to North Korea to offer us some kind of protection while we were there. And the stadium event you're talking about is we met with Kim Jong-un. He said, I'm going to take you somewhere. One does not control one's schedule. Even if you're the Secretary of State of the United States when you're in North Korea, they decide what you're going to do. So they put us in cars. We didn't know where we were going. We showed up at this gigantic, enormous stadium, larger than anything we have here in the United States. We walked in with Kim Jong-il to hundreds of thousands of people cheering, some on the floor doing acrobats, some in the stands with flip cards, making revolutionary pictures as we were watching these acrobats. It was very awkward because you don't want to applaud a dictator. You don't want to smile like you're having a good time because you know all of those people have been told to come to this stadium. So it was awkward. We tried to be polite without going overboard, but it was truly an extraordinary experience.
Have you received any beautiful love letters?
No, I haven't received any beautiful love letters.
Well, I don't understand why not.
Right.
Of course, you know that there has been talk in the administration of reducing our force level in South Korea. We have about 30,000 troops there. And a Korean organization has done a poll finding that at least 50% of Americans want to keep the level where it is. Some would like to increase it, maybe 7%. No more than 20% want to see it reduced. What do you think?
Well, I think, we're going to have to see what the situation is. I don't think right now is the time to reduce that troop level. That's exactly what North Korea would like to see happen. I think that we have a very fraught relationship with the Republic of Korea, and we really shouldn't. They have hosted our troops. They pay a good deal of the freight of our troops being there. And the troops are there not only to protect South Korea and the Korean Peninsula, and to make sure that we have a strong alliance with Japan, who is indeed our ally. We have troops in Japan as well, but to protect the United States of America. We are not just an Atlantic power. We are also a Pacific power. And so we have interests in the Pacific. And obviously we have interests more and more these days where China is concerned as China builds its military. So I think the next administration, whoever that is, I obviously have a favorite, but whoever that is has to take a very hard look at our military posture in the Pacific. President Obama shifted resources more towards the Pacific because he understood the growing geopolitics demanded it. So I think we're going to have to make very tough assessments about where our troops are. I understand that the American people want all of our troops to come home. There's nothing more difficult for any president of the United States than to send our young men and women abroad, particularly when they could be in harm's way. So these are very tough decisions, and they have to be taken in a very serious manner.
I think the administration would like to press on South Korea to spend more to support those troops. What is it now, about 850 million, something like that? The administration wants 5 billion.
Yes, well, I think that the South Koreans have hosted us. They have paid for our presence. We are not just there for South Korea, we are there for ourselves. And so again, we're going to have to make an assessment of what's fair. I know that President Trump has said that the world has taken advantage of us. And I think one of the things he doesn't always point out to Americans is what's in our interest. And it's not just a transactional quid pro quo tit for tat. It is what is in our geostrategic interest. How do we protect the United States of America? And those are really the choices that have to be made here.
I'm reminded of the subtitle of your book, Lessons in Courage, Power, and Persistence. And it seems to me you're talking about American power and American influence. But let's turn to Syria. You were on the 7th floor of the State Department when, in August of 2013, Bashar al-Assad attacked his people, some of his people, with chemical weapons. And a year before, President Obama said, that's a red line for me. He was going to attack. He decided to send it to Congress, and everybody knew that there would be no approval there. You and some of your colleagues were quite upset about that. What would you like to have seen done?
Yes, it was a really difficult decision for President Obama. I understood why he made it. He was afraid of a slippery slope, that if we took a military strike, we'd end up sending troops. Americans wanted to pull out of the Middle East, not get more into it. He knew that he wouldn't have the backing of the United States Congress. You may have remembered some time earlier, Prime Minister Cameron in Great Britain took a vote in the British Parliament and he lost it. There just wasn't energy, political energy and will to deal with this in a military fashion. I was quite disappointed. On a Friday afternoon, Secretary Kerry had made a speech that everyone thought was fantastic and would be the rationale for taking that military strike. But by Saturday morning, it wasn't to happen. It was a very difficult moment. As it turned out, Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia made a sort of off-the-cuff comment about getting Assad to agree to get rid of his chemical weapons. And in response to something Secretary Kerry had said about that, of course, we could deal with Syria if they got rid of their chemical weapons. So Lavrov picked that up and said, okay, let's make a deal. And so I went with Secretary Kerry and an interagency team off to Geneva for a long weekend to see if we could put a deal together with the Russians to get all of the declared chemical weapons out of Syria. And lo and behold, we did. That was very difficult to do. It was very difficult to implement. I teach students about how to develop policy and tell them policy is all great, but then you have to execute, you have to implement it, and it's never good if you can't. So we did. We did find out later there were some undeclared, not the same things that went out, but some other things that could create problems, and certainly probably chlorine gas that probably harmed Syrians. Assad continued to attack his own people. But we did get out of Syria staggering amounts of chemical weapons and did a deal with the Russians. That was helpful in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action months later because Foreign Minister Lavrov was very involved. And so was Sergei Ryabkov, his wingman. I was John Kerry's wingman. And Ryabkov and I had to work very closely to get the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The Russians are very smart, very capable, have a good bench when it comes to these kinds of issues, but one has to be wary, as we all know and have seen, as Russia has interfered in our elections.
What in the world do you see ahead for Iran, Iraq, and Syria?
It really depends, Lee, on who the next president of the United States is. President Trump has said that he wants to continue to put maximum pressure on Iran, believing he will bring them to the negotiating table and they will quickly do whatever he wants. Iran is a resistance culture. I doubt it will happen that quickly or easily. My guess is at some point they probably might come to the table, but it will be tough going, very tough going. I think where Syria is concerned, there have been reports recently that a member of the Security Council went to Syria to try to get some of the Americans held, including Austin Tice, out of Syria. We all would hope that there would be a positive outcome to such an effort. That is a good thing, no matter who is president, to return Americans held hostage home to their loved ones. I think Iraq has made some progress, but it is still a tough go. The Middle East is a tough neighborhood, and we should be engaged where we must, but be very careful of getting sucked in to things we have no control over. Yemen being one of those instances where Saudi Arabia has helped fuel a civil war, and then Iran helped to fuel that civil war, and it's really turned into a proxy war with Americans caught a little bit in the middle because we've had some troops in the area as well.
Speaking of military action, you make a fascinating point in your book about international law and what would have been involved in a strike on Syria. It's not that easy as striking within Iraq, for example.
Right, indeed. It's a real question under what auspices we would do that. We were able to take some action to protect the Iraqi border at Iraq's request. But if we had attacked Syrian airfields or Syrian airplanes that were on the ground, we would have been attacking a country that had not asked us to intervene. There is some theory that those in the region could have asked us for support and action. There is a concept in the world about a responsibility to protect when a government doesn't protect its own people, that you can intervene, but that's not really in our jurisprudence in the United States quite yet. It is in other nations, and it is at the UN in a conceptual framework, but it certainly is something that has touched the hearts of everyone when we have seen children who have been attacked chemically or by gas, by sarin or by chlorine, by Assad, dying in front of their parents dying. It's horrifying. It's truly horrifying. And I think that all of our hearts want to do something about it. The question is, what do we have a right to do? And where do we have a right to intervene? These humanitarian disasters, as well as these military conflicts, are very, very, very tough decisions for any commander-in-chief.
Well, when you were leaving the State Department, maybe you'll be back in the State Department someday, but after that run at the State Department, President Obama invited you to lunch, just the two of you. Tell me about that day. That turned out to be very special.
It was a very special day. I finished on a Friday. My husband and I packed up the car and drove to Boston. And then I got on an airplane Monday morning and came back to Washington, D.C. because the president had asked me to have lunch one-on-one. And you sort of don't say no to the president of the United States. No. It was really very special because before we had lunch in his private dining room, he presented me with the National Security Medal. It used to be given only to people in the intelligence community, but 3 days earlier, he had issued an executive order making it more broadly available. And I was the first one to receive it under the new terms for the work that I did as the Undersecretary for Political Affairs and the Iran nuclear deal. And I was very moved by that. The lunch with the president was really wonderful. He's an incredibly thoughtful person. And most people thought we'd talk about the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. But in fact, as the bookend to the issues you raised about Syria, we talked about Syria because it was probably the most difficult struggle for the president to think through what was the right thing to do. And he knew I'd thought differently than he did about what we should do. And I felt very honored that he would want to continue that discussion. He is an incredibly thoughtful, decisive man who listens to all the voices at the table, really learns his brief and makes a decision with great clarity. You see President Obama there, Vice President Biden, Secretary Kerry, Eric Holder. The woman right here closest is Susan Rice, who was National Security Advisor.
Well, in fact, Susan Rice came out and warned you before you went in for lunch that you were going to receive this medal because she knew it would make you weep. It makes me weep thinking about it.
Yes, so Susan Rice and Susie George, who was her chief of staff, were both and are dear friends of mine. And they know whenever I'm emotional, I tend to cry.
Why not? So do I.
Same thing when I get really, really angry, which is another story in the book. I'll save the book. But somewhere along the line, as a woman, I learned it wasn't okay to get angry. Crying was okay. And so they came out and said, the president's going to give you, in the waiting room, the president's going to give you the National Security Medal. And we're telling you now because we don't want you to cry in front of the I thought that was real friendship on their part.
It was indeed.
And I did not cry.
Well, you teach about leadership at the Leadership Center. And of course, I have marveled, maybe you have too, at the women leaders in the world at the moment. I mean, Angela Merkel has been, well, she's held Europe together. There's no question about
Absolutely.
that. Jacinda Ardern, just re-elected in a landslide as Prime Minister of New Zealand, did a fantastic job handling COVID. Go early, go hard, she did. We've had women running Taiwan, running Norway, running Iceland, running Finland, all to very good effect. Are there any thoughts you have about these women leaders? And it isn't just a matter of they're being nice or they're listening. I know all of that, but I think there's something more.
Yes, so two things about this. Depending upon how you count, only 7 or 8% of all of the leaders in the world are women. So it's a very small N, as we say in research, very small number. And it appears that they did well in this time of COVID in their leadership. I actually ran a seminar this past summer with incoming students about whether women really did better as leaders in the time of COVID. And I had some graduate students do some research as a result of that seminar. And what they have found out in that research is that it has more to do with the attributes of these leaders. And there are some men who have similar attributes. Communication skills that are direct and clear. Empathy counts, but it's communication and acting swiftly. Prime Minister Ardern closed down New Zealand very quickly. She communicated quite well. She's only 40 years old. It's quite extraordinary what she's done. She also handled a terrorism incident that was quite horrible in New Zealand, in Christchurch, very well. And both of these were examples of decisiveness, quick action, clear communications, and that got to an end. You're quite right, Lee. Angela Merkel has held Europe together. There's great concern about what's going to happen as she steps back in the not too distant future. There's really no one else. Boris Johnson is completely absorbed with Brexit. Macron, of France, although he has great ambition, has terrible poll numbers and not a lot of support. So where Europe goes is very concerning. And of course, we have countries like Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic that are heading to the right. The right-wing parties in Europe have risen, just as we've seen authoritarian leaders rise around the world. And it's not a big surprise because people are very anxious in these very uncertain times. The world is changing very rapidly and people want assurance, and sometimes they're willing to give up their liberty for those assurances, even if those assurances turn out to be oppressive and not real at all.
One more thing about women, I think you said they are decisive and act quickly. And I would add that they have nerve. I mean, the nerve of a high diver. That's what it takes to act quickly and make a decision when you don't have all the information you would like to have, and you can't do a study and you can't have a commission. And
indeed, I think in part for women to become leaders of their country, they've had to go through a heck of a lot. They've had to be really, really good at what they do. They've had to learn a lot. They've had to take risks, but they also know that they're going to be judged perhaps more harshly. And so they often will make sure they have advisors and science and listen to other voices and then make great and very firm decisions.
You have worked with 4 secretaries of state, Warren Christopher, Madeleine Albright, Hillary Clinton, and John Kerry. How would you assess each of them?
They're all fantastic. They were the right secretaries of state for the time. When Bill Clinton was just beginning and didn't know a whole lot about national security and foreign policy, Warren Christopher, who had been Deputy Secretary of State earlier in his career, was an eminence grise, an older man who knew the world, wouldn't get him in trouble, made him Secretary of State. For his second term, when he had more capital to spend, he made a historic choice and made Madeleine Albright the first woman Secretary of State. And as we all know, she is a risk taker. She's outspoken. She's very approachable. Right second-term Secretary of State. President Obama was also young, had only been in the Senate for 2 years, very wisely made Hillary Clinton his Secretary of State because after the Iraq War, he knew that he needed to send a signal to the world that we are back. And so he took Hillary Clinton, who knew everybody in the world. She could pick up the phone and call everyone. It wouldn't have to all rest on President Obama's shoulders. She was seasoned and wise and very capable. And then in the second term, when there were some tough things to be done and he could take some more risks, John Kerry, who's very much a risk taker as well, was the right Secretary of State. That's me next to him, as you can see with the white hair, in Vienna at the Palais Coburg.
Well,
I was a little skeptical then, but it all turned out okay.
Let's have some questions. This is from Raymond Termini. Mr. Biden says that he would return to the JCPOA nuclear deal if Iran returns to compliance. He has also said that he would take a tough stance on Iran's behavior in the Middle East. What advice would you give him?
Well, I think that's the right place to start. I know the vice president rather well. I've known him since he was in the Senate. He is incredibly capable. He's been through the ropes many times. He is very substantive. I think we saw that in the town hall that he did just last week when it comes to national security and foreign policy. I think he will have a phenomenal bench of talent that he'll bring with him, very capable, competent people. And so I think he should be a tough negotiator. I think he wants to ensure some stability for a while, to calm the tensions, to get back to a more stable playing field, and then build off of that to deal with the malign behavior of Iran, their human rights abuses, their state sponsorship of terrorism, get any American out of Evin prison that's there, help other countries get their countrymen out, and really try to make a difference. There's a lot that can be done here, but it's going to be hard going. One will have to persist.
And that's what you say in your book.
Indeed.
Courage, power, persistence. Raymond Termini has a second question. What was not included in the JCPOA that you would insist upon in a new deal?
Well, you know, that's very hard for me to say because you don't know what you can do till you're in the room and you get the fingertips for what you can get done in a negotiation. This deal, if we get back to it, is already several years old. So like most arms control agreements, you need a follow-on agreement that increases the timeline and the strength and the durability of the deal. So that I think will be something that the vice president, if he becomes president of the United States, and as you know, I hope he will have to think through very carefully.
And this is Mary Siebel. If the current administration loses the election, how tough will it be for the U.S. to rejoin its allies in Europe and around the world in initiatives that are mutually beneficial? Has permanent damage been done by the Trump nationalist policies?
Well, I don't think permanent damage has been done, but it's not like overnight everybody's going to say, we love you back after all the damage that has been done. It is a good thing that Vice President Biden knows all these leaders, has personal relationships with all these leaders. They know him and trust him personally, but they'll have to regain their trust, Europe in particular, with the United States, see where our interests are in common. China is obviously at the top of that list, where we will be much stronger if we work together as opposed to work separately. That's one area where we should have overlapping interests to be able to compete and challenge China, where we must cooperate on things like climate, where we must for the sake of the world. So it's going to be very hard work, and President Biden's going to have to repopulate these agencies, get everything back up and running, reestablish relationships, get our diplomats out in the world. There's a lot of work to be done. It's going to be hard going, and we're going to be doing it before the COVID crisis is over and while we're trying to rebuild our economy. And quite frankly, the president of the United States is going to have to focus inside the United States, just like every other country will, in the first instance, to rebuild our economy, rebuild our strength, rebuild our power, as some might say, build back better.
This is from Alana. What are some of the most common critiques of the JCPOA? And can you explain from the perspective of the negotiator, that's you, why it landed the way it did?
So I think some people certainly have said it should have included all these other issues, particularly Iran's malign behavior in the region. And I've explained a little bit why that was very hard to do. Some people have said that Iran shouldn't have been allowed to keep a civil nuclear program at all. And our European allies, let alone Russia and China, always thought we should have left them with some capability to have civil nuclear energy under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. If you're a signatory to the treaty, you are allowed to have a peaceful civil nuclear program. Most people don't know that in 1954, President Eisenhower, Republican, under the Atoms for Peace program, gave Iran its first 5-megawatt reactor and the material for the reactor. So we actually helped Iran create its nuclear program. This is a very complicated history, and one has to appreciate the history to know where we are. Some people have said that the timelines on some of the restrictions should have been longer. That's a negotiating point. I think we got incredibly long timelines, 10 years, 15 years, 20, 25, and some forever. But there have been critics of those restrictions for sure.
And this is from Kirsten Cullenberg, whom we saw earlier at the World Affairs Council. Can you speak on the implications behind this new missile we saw in the last week or so at North Korea? Yes, there was a great big parade and the biggest ICBM ever in North Korea. What do you make of it?
Well, I make of it that the president's effort to use his bromance, there's that missile in their incredible parades, to use his bromance to get North Korea to step back, that if that missile is actually functional, and I don't have access to intelligence anymore, so I don't know whether we know whether it actually works, but if it is functional, then it just says that the administration's policy has really not only not helped us move forward, but it has set us back. Because even if North Korea has not tested another nuclear weapon, there's the president with Kim Jong-un, and if North Korea has not tested a long-range ballistic missile, they have increased their capability in both of those regards. We know they've built more nuclear weapons. We know they've built more missiles, and you can use computers and other technology to do testing without actually doing the testing. So there's a lot I don't know because I'm not privy to intelligence anymore, but North Korea is one really tough problem, much tougher even than Iran.
And this is Brendan McGuire. Can you comment on the missile strike against Soleimani?
Well, you know, I don't shed a tear for the fact that Qasem Soleimani is dead. He was a horrible person who killed or helped to kill or made it possible to kill Americans. So I don't shed a tear. It was a very risky move by President Trump because we knew there would be retaliation. Fortunately, the immediate retaliation didn't end up in the death of American soldiers, though it did end up in giving many American soldiers likely brain injury, the extent of which I don't think any of us still know. So it was very risky, and it certainly became a point at which Iran started to take steps, most of which are reversible, but steps to move forward with its enrichment program and with its plutonium reactor. So don't shed a tear for his death. Risky step by the president, has had, I believe, some downsides. I don't know yet whether it acted as a deterrence in any real terms because I'm not again, privy to the intelligence to know what the reaction was inside of Iran. But it gave Iran a point at which it could nationalize its people, because Soleimani was a hero inside of Iran, even to people who don't like the regime, which is sort of awful. But it allowed the regime to whip up anti-American fervor when just a couple of weeks earlier, there had been Iranians on the street protesting their own government.
You know, Zarif was in New York, as you know, in September, and spoke with Fareed Zakaria and said the books are not closed on that matter. What did that mean?
That meant that there may be further retaliation at a time and place of their choosing. That's what that means.
This is Sarmita Mishra, a yoga teacher. Though I prefer not to generalize gender-based characteristics, what recurring qualities have you observed in the leader identifying as female, be it in administrations around the world or local community organizations? Consequently, what is your leadership? I'm not seeing the rest of this. Oh, here we go. What is your leadership message to young people today to give them the courage to be impactful?
Well, this is what I spend all of my time doing now, which is to teach graduate students at the Kennedy School and to run the Center for Public Leadership, because I think the next generation of public leaders around the world is so absolutely crucial. And I think that we all come with different strengths, and we need to use those strengths for good. Power, for instance, is something that women, again, not to be stereotypical, it's not true for all women or for all men, but women often are taught that power is an icky thing, that it's bad. Power in and of itself is not bad, it's how you use that power. It doesn't always have to corrupt, but it certainly can. So women need to learn who they are authentically, to use the power that they have. One of the things that Madeleine Albright, a dear friend, business partner, former boss, colleague, all of these things, taught me when she was at the United Nations. She sat behind, there we are, I think at the Albright Institute at Wellesley College, sharing our long friendship with each other and what we learned from each other. But she learned at the UN that even though she was a woman, she sat behind a sign that said the United States of America. And if you understand when you walk in the room that you are less Wendy Sherman, in my case, I'm an American Jew, and that was sort of strange with Iranians who want to wipe Israel off the face of the earth and deny the Holocaust. I am more than anything else, the United States of America. And that's pretty powerful. And there I am, that was at a Syrian negotiation with the Russians, which didn't amount to a whole lot, with Lakhdar Brahimi as the special envoy from the UN trying to get us to some agreement, which we were never able to really reach, about the Syrian civil war itself. But when you sit behind that sign, you have a great deal of power. And so you have to learn how to make use of it. So we try to teach skills around the use of power, around negotiation, around leadership, around ethics, around all of the skill sets, from writing memos to briefing people, to public speaking, to communications, all of the things that one has to do, whether you're a public leader, a business leader, a civil society leader. You need all of those skill sets, being able to read a room, put a strategy together, drive toward an outcome. And the two words that were in the subtitle of the book as well, you have to have courage, because some of these things are very hard to do. What President Obama did around Iran was very courageous, and you have to persist, because in diplomacy particularly, things sometimes come together and then fall apart. And then you have to put them back together again, and then they fall apart. You have to put them back together again.
Well, here's an easy question to close with. What should a Biden administration do differently with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Not easy.
Yeah, real easy. I've been lucky enough to be at many of the meetings at Wye River and Shepherdstown with the Syrians, and some of the time at Camp David during the Clinton administration. then certainly go to the region many times during the Obama years. This is very hard. When the UAE made its recent deal with Israel under the Abraham Accords, and that was a good thing that was done, they did it in part because they wanted to ensure that Prime Minister Netanyahu would not annex whole sections of what now is home to the Palestinian Authority, because had that happened, it would have ended any possibility of a two-state solution. That said, we have to make sure that the Palestinians are not forgotten as other countries perhaps normalize relations with Israel, all of which is a good thing if it's real, but the Palestinians cannot be forgotten in that process because they deserve a homeland as long as Israel can remain a Jewish state living in peace and security. So Israel's security is obviously foremost from an American perspective, and that it maintains its identity as a Jewish state. But the only way that will happen is with, I believe, a two-state solution, and it's going to be hard work.
Kirsten Cullenberg does have another question. You were one of the country's best negotiators. What lessons from your diplomatic experiences could the average person use in their lives?
Well, you know, I'm a mom. My daughter's now grown up and has two tiny little boys of her own. And I remember, and I told her that if you've dealt with a 2-year-old or a teenager, you know how to negotiate. So whether it's in your own family or negotiating a job or a salary, or negotiating with someone across the table around a nuclear deal, you have to be clear about what you want, try to offer some choices so it doesn't become a zero-sum game, make sure the person across the table, even the 2-year-old, has some agency, some sense of power. Otherwise, it's just going to be a battle for which there is no outcome. But make sure you know what your bottom line is, what that 2-year-old can choose between, but what he or she can't have, what the real bottom line is for your own interests. So those rules pretty much stick no matter what you're doing.
You said of your father, and I won't go into lots of detail about him, but he sounded like a wonderful man, Mal Sherman, that he was able to imagine a different world. And the same thing was said of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She could imagine a different world. Don't you feel the same is true of you? You could imagine the Iran deal working when nobody else could.
Well, I wasn't the only one who could imagine it. I start with President Obama and Secretary Kerry and many other people in imagining what was possible. And I give even the Iranians some credit because they came to the table and worked on this deal. And obviously all of my partners at the table were trying to imagine a world where Iran wouldn't obtain a nuclear weapon. So yes, one has to imagine what you want and try to work with the way the world is to get to the way you want the world to be. But it does take courage, power, and persistence. And in the book, I tell personal stories as well in my own life, because all of this is not for the faint of heart.
Wow, what a wonderful discussion. I'd like to thank Lee for joining us today and moderating this great conversation, and to take a moment to thank Ambassador Sherman for taking the time. If you can have such a thing as a diplomatic hero, Ambassador Sherman is definitely one of mine. So it's been wonderful to hear this discussion today. Thank you. I'd like to remind all of our viewers that you can purchase a copy of Not for the Faint of Heart, Lessons in Courage, Power, and Persistence at interabangbooks.com. Using the code dfwworld at checkout, you will receive not only 10% off your online order, but also a signed book plate with a copy of Ambassador Sherman's book. I'd like to also take a moment to thank our sponsors of our webinars this year. It's certainly been an interesting year as we engage with our members and the North Texas public online. So if you'd like to support one of our webinars and help us bring wonderful conversations like this to North Texas, reach out to us and we can certainly help facilitate that for you. Quick reminder that you can sign up for any of our upcoming events at dfwworld.org/events. And subscribe to our YouTube channel, DFW World, where you can view not only this webinar, but all of our webinars that we've hosted this year and will continue to host in the future. Thank you all for joining us today. Have a wonderful day, and we will see you next time.